Hello and welcome to Lights, Cable, Action, the voice of Selco. I'm here with Michael Hale, I'm Maria Lemieux, and we're the hosts of your show. Today we are going to welcome, and we're very excited to have, members of EMWC with us to explain what they do for Selco and what they are exactly. With us today are Ron DiCurzio, the CEO of EMWC, Mike Lynch, Director of Marketing and Management Planning, and Matt Ide, the Director of Treasuries and Commodities. So welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you guys for coming this afternoon. Appreciate it.
In the most simplest of terms, they will describe what they do for us and what they're all about. So to get started, what is EMWC and how did it come about?
Well, I thank you for having us again. I think it's very appropriate that we are here in Shrewsbury today to talk about the history of EMWC. As time goes by and generations pass, sometimes we forget our history. And the history of EMWC can be tied directly to the Shrewsbury Light Department. Back in 1958, when James Baker was hired to be the general manager of Shrewsbury, he envisioned, or Shrewsbury at the time, I should say, was buying its power directly from a retail provider, who in turn was buying their power from a wholesale. James Baker and the Shrewsbury Light Commission felt that they could do better for the ratepayers of Shrewsbury and wanted to see if the municipal light departments could in turn buy their power directly from the wholesaler. So through a great deal of effort in both the Commonwealth of Massachusetts courts and the federal courts, James Baker and the Shrewsbury Light Commission was successful in getting the courts to rule in their favor that they could buy wholesale power directly for the municipal light departments.
Thus lowering the costs for
Thus lowering the costs for the customers, correct. So the next step for James Baker was to develop municipal wholesale power aggregator, if you will, and that was EMWC. EMWC standing for the Massachusetts Municipal Wholesale Electric Company. That happened around 1969. In fact, James Baker was EMWC's first chairman. He held that title from 1969 through 1983. It was during that time we started purchasing wholesale power, but something was still missing. In order to really provide that cheap benefit to the ratepayers, they felt that they had to own the generation as well. So in 1975, the then Governor, Michael Dukakis, signed Chapter 775, which is a law of Massachusetts. It gave EMWC the legislative authority to issue tax-exempt bonds. The tax-exempt bonds were very instrumental in EMWC fulfilling its obligations to plan, finance, and construct power supply. Part of that power supply being PSA entitlements that Shrewsbury has for the Stony Brook Energy Center power plant, Seabrook Nuclear Station power plant, Millstone power plant, and Wyman power plant. Throughout
New England.
Yes. Throughout EMWC's inception, we've issued about $5 billion in debt. And later on in the program, you're going to hear from the EMWC staff explaining how those generation assets are beneficial to your customers and how the debt service is now playing a vital role in keeping your rates low. Fast forward to today, and in keeping with the consumer theme that James Baker envisioned when he started the wholesale power idea, EMWC is motivated by what we call the not-so-fictional Mrs. Jones. Mrs. Jones is your typical fixed income ratepayer. And in fact, I think you're going to see a screenshot of our 2010 annual report where we dedicated to Mrs. Jones. And in the inside cover, it reads Mrs. Jones of Shrewsbury. It's what the staff is motivated by to keep the rates at a non-volatile pace and at the lowest possible cost for your ratepayers. So as a joint action agency, EMWC basically provides the two essential services that James Baker envisioned, one being the power supply planning and the other being the generation assets. And like I mentioned, through the various legal power sales agreements, as we call them, and you'll see a slide of that later of how much entitlement Selco owns in each of those power plants. We're able to really complete the circle and be able to plan the power supply and also purchase the power supply, both from a one-on-one contract, bilateral contract basis, and also from the generating power plants. And I think that with that, I'm going to turn it over to Matthew.
Just a couple questions. Okay. One, Ron, you could touch a little bit on what comprises EMWC. It's not just Shrewsbury Electric, but who are your members? Where are they located? And we all share a common interest in that we're Massachusetts municipal electric entities.
Yes, so with Chapter 775, that was structured specifically for the 40 municipal light departments in Massachusetts. There are 40. EMWC is divided into two sectors, really. One is what we call the service side of the house, which provides various power supply planning and those type of services. The other is what we call the project participant side of the house. And the project participants are those that participate in the Seabrooks, in the Millstones, in the Wymans, and any other project that we think is formidable at the time. So there's two halves of the house, if you will.
And there's about 21 municipal electric utilities actively engaged with EMWC in carrying out their power supply initiatives.
That is correct. From 1975 on, there's been various numbers of members in EMWC, and Joint Action Agency is exactly that. Joint Action Agency is not for everyone. Some municipal light departments have staffs where they can handle most of those activities. Others don't, and that's where the joint action comes in, and that's what James Baker envisioned when he wanted to put it together. It's a way to commingle and save costs for the ratepayers.
Efficiencies through cooperative
Correct.
cooperation.
Correct.
I think in segueing to the other two officials here from EMWC, I think it's just important to briefly point out during the lifespan of EMWC how the market has changed a little bit and how municipal utilities differ, before we get into power supply, how they differ from investor-owned utilities like National Grid and Eversource in how they secure their energy needs for their customers. So I don't know if Matt, you want to handle that?
Sure, Mike. Again, thank you very much for the opportunity. It's very important that your customers realize the benefit that they are currently in being served by a municipal utility. And the reason why it's such a benefit is that with the deregulated electric market, the municipal utility still retains a very strong advantage in the fact that it can be what they call vertically integrated. And what that really simply means is that they can go out and they can own generating assets, they can go out and acquire power on a long-term basis, and they also can translate all that savings and stability in the power price to their customers without having to go through the DPU or a regulated commission or an entity of that nature. In this marketplace, that is very different than the investor-owned utilities. The investor-owned utilities are mandated every 6 months to procure power, which subjects their customers to the cost of power every 6 months, depending on how power is traded. There are very limited opportunities that investor-owned utilities have to effectively hedge or take over a long period of time the power cost and stabilize that. So that's why you see in the paper a lot of times every 6 months announcements that the investor-owned utilities are raising rates. They're raising them, they're lowering them, they're raising them back. There's all that up and down, up and down. Customers of a municipally owned utility, because of the fact that it's vertically integrated, can have and enjoy very stable long-term rates, which creates, we think, a very, very valuable value proposition to a customer of a municipal utility company.
Yeah, and the investor-owned utilities like National Grid had those benefits until the deregulation occurred in the late 90s, 97 era, at which time they had to divest all their ownership interests in power plants,
right,
and just really become distribution systems as well as transmission owners of the high tension lines.
That is correct.
So-
That's right.
And Matt touched on it. One of the commonalities of all the 40 municipal light departments is they want to eliminate that volatility in their rates. And Matt alluded to, especially this past winter, you heard about the 30–40% increases to the investor-owned utilities, where most of the municipalities were immune to that. And that's because we can own the generation. We can go out and hedge our contracts for a longer period of time.
And we use, for an example, we've used, Ron, this studio sits right east of Lake Quinsigamond, which is a narrow strip of water. So if you live on the east side of Lake Quinsigamond and you procure the average customer's bill in the winter was about $101 if you lived on the east side of the lake. But if you lived on the west side of the lake, that was $180. And a lot of that is governed by our ability to own generation to offset or hedge against wild swings in pricing.
And that's the key, where sometimes we might not be the cheapest game in town, you won't have those wild swings. And that's what Mrs. Jones really is looking for, because she's on a fixed income. She needs to plan where her dollars are going to go, and this enables her to plan where her dollars can go and not be surprised.
So I think really then, Matt, if you could touch a little bit about on what generation assets Shrewsbury owns, and then maybe talk a little bit about how our energy portfolio might differ from the portfolio of the region in general.
Great. Well, we did actually bring a slide, Mike, that does list the generating assets that Shrewsbury owns. And the way Shrewsbury owns generating assets is as a participant in an MWIC project. So each generating asset is an MWIC project, and then Shrewsbury participates in that project by securing the output from that generator as a fixed percentage. And the chart that you're seeing on the screen does list the projects that Shrewsbury currently participates in with MWIC. And they range from our Stony Brook Energy Center, which is located in Ludlow, Massachusetts, to Wyman, which is an oil-fired generating unit up in Maine. And Shrewsbury also participates in nuclear assets in our projects, which are from Seabrook up in New Hampshire and Millstone 3, which is in Connecticut. And then the way we organize the projects, you may have the same generating asset and we have multiple projects. So in fact, if you actually add up the number of projects you participate in, there are 6 projects that you're currently participating in that are the generating assets of Stony Brook, Wyman, Seabrook, and Millstone 3. And the big advantage of owning these generating assets is that through the operation of those generating assets, we're controlling the costs that it takes to generate that power. And then what will end up happening is that financially for the ratepayers of Shrewsbury, the benefit of having an ownership interest in that generating station will actually augment and moderate the cost of power associated with the output. So that's one of the biggest advantages. In addition, and Mike will speak to this I think a little later on, and if I can just kind of step back a bit, at least when we talk about the cost of your power, your customers are paying for power in 3 specific items. One, which is what my team really focuses on, which is the actual commodity cost of power, procuring the electron. But there are 2 other parts of the cost. The second cost is a cost called capacity. And in this market, customers are charged a capacity cost to ensure that there are generators that are generating ample amounts of power in the system. And then the last component of the cost is transmission cost. And that's to provide revenue to provide for the cost of generating power from a generating station to the local distribution companies. The combination of those 3 really makes up your power cost. Now,
so it's the high tension lines that you see when you travel throughout the state takes the power from the power plants to a location in the community, Shrewsbury, our substations located at Rolfe Avenue and Centec Boulevard. And the other 2 components would be capacity payment in the electric markets in the New England region. And we'll talk about that a little bit on our next show in greater detail. And the third would be the actual generators themselves.
Right, the actual
Energy.
energy
The energy,
itself.
the electrons generated from.
Right.
Right.
So we talked a little bit about the first benefit of generation asset ownership was kind of the stability of the cost of the energy. But there's another major advantage of owning a generating asset, and that is the fact that as an owner of a generating asset, you are also receiving revenue for capacity. And this is a very, very important benefit in owning a generating asset that you can pass on to your customers, because customers who consume electricity are charged for capacity. But in Shrewsbury's case, because those same customers own generating capacity, they are getting the revenue. So effectively, it's a hedge against this capacity cost. So if you think about the major reasons why it's important to have asset ownership, there's the stability of the overall energy cost, because you're an owner of a generating asset. In addition to that, you are also getting benefit because you are also receiving revenue to offset the cost of capacity. That combination is a very financially powerful advantage to a customer of Shrewsbury, and it's one of the major advantages of being served by a municipal system.
Right. Essentially, instead of paying a third party for that capacity, you're essentially paying yourself and remaining neutral.
And the other, I don't want to take you off your point, but I think the other, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the other generation asset that we own went online in May of 2011, and that's a Berkshire Wind, which at the time was the largest wind energy producing facility in Massachusetts. It might be second now. I don't know.
It's second now.
Second now.
Yep.
But we are 13% ownership in that asset, which produces about 15 megawatts of energy when it's at full capacity.
Right.
So that's just another example of MWIC taking a leadership role in organizing its members to pool their funds together to build, in this case, another generation asset for which revenue is received to offset the higher costs of the capacity market. So we thank you for that. The project's gone on, has gone very well.
In addition to these power sales agreement type generation assets, we also provide what we call PPAs, power purchase agreements, and Selco does have various hydro components related to those PPAs.
Right, which includes your entitlement of the Niagara Power that we were able to procure from the state of New York, which provides us with cheap hydropower throughout the year.
And also provides for a credit on our customers' bills, the NYPA.
Right, the NYPA credit.
Yeah. So I'm sorry, Matt, to interrupt you.
So I do think this does segue a little bit into how the generating assets that Shrewsbury participates in, how does that kind of stack up compared to the overall grid in New England, and then Shrewsbury's commitment to try to be as carbon free as they possibly can. So we did bring a slide on, and I think your viewers may be looking at it now, that kind of looks at when you add up all of Shrewsbury's generating assets, you can see that they have a very large portion that are not carbon emitting compared to ISO New England, which is on the pie chart to the right. And I think this kind of does illustrate the point that Shrewsbury is generating very environmentally friendly generating assets into the New England mix.
So in the case for Shrewsbury, if you took the nuclear and the renewables and added them together, that's our so-called non-carbon footprint, which is a fairly large, more than two-thirds of our overall portfolio.
That's right. So we've kind of talked a little bit about the generating assets and how important they are in your power supply. But there's two other components that we look to as well. And that is we look to forecast obviously what your customers' needs are. And then we figure out how much the generating assets are really responsible for supplying that from a volume perspective. And then what we do is we go out in the marketplace and we talk to other power providers and negotiate long-term power contracts with them, or what we would commonly call hedges, to create that level of price stability over a long period of time for you. And then the last component is we do buy power on the spot market in that given day when we need to effectively balance your load. So if you think about how we think when we construct your power supply portfolio, it really is based on the first objective, which is to provide price stability. And we believe over the long term that stable price is actually a very, very economical price for your customers. And we do that by essentially 3 legs of the proverbial stool: generating assets, these long-term power supply contracts and purchase contracts, and then also buying on the open market. And it's the combination of putting those 3 things together that our team on the power supply side and on the commodity side do when we're balancing and constructing the portfolio. But it's all about trying to reduce the risk of fluctuating prices and keep prices as stable as we possibly can for Mrs. Jones.
So say, for an example, in simple terms, Matt, tomorrow's a new day.
Mm-hmm.
We kind of know what we're going to need historically for power in the community of Shrewsbury, based on a number of factors: historical use and what the weather is going to be like, projected weather is going to be like. How much of our power is exposed to the open market for tomorrow, or say even Monday, for example,
Right.
versus if we lived in Worcester on the other side of the lake, how is theirs different than ours? And I think that's an interesting point.
Yeah.
So when you talk about hedging, really you can talk to our customers a little bit about how much risk is removed by hedging in the, for the future.
Yeah. Basically, for the Shrewsbury portfolio, in excess of 80% of that portfolio need has been hedged. So you have effectively less than 20% of your needs exposed to the open market. In addition to that, we look at some very volatile times, which traditionally has been the summer, but over the last few years it's actually been more in the winter. And in consultation with the light department, we've actually tightened those areas up to less than 20%. But in general, you could expect that your entire portfolio is less than 20% open to the market, compared to an investor-owned utility, which, because they have to buy every 6 months, you're really making the case that they're almost fully open to the fluctuations of the market, because they cannot buy or hedge over the long term. They can only come in all at once every 6 months. And that's a big difference of why we can work to keep the rates stable, whereas an investor-owned utility, it's bouncing all over. And when you think about your customers, your small businesses who are on budgets and they are competing in a very competitive environment, the fact that Shrewsbury can deliver to them stable pricing, we think, is a very, very attractive proposition for your customers.
And it's also where joint action comes into play again, because the 21 members that we have, Matt and his group, basically, they're able to combine the 21 needs and diversify their purchases enough where it eliminates most of the risk in terms of those purchases as well. He tries to keep a diversification in the fuels they buy, the counterparties that they deal with, and being that we're doing it as a pooled organization, it makes it a lot easier.
And there has been, over the last 5 to 7 years, a renewed interest in diversifying portfolios with renewables. We certainly have entertained that, but we do it in a way. At SELCO, the Commission has a long-standing mission of providing the most reliability trumps all at the best price. So when there's a energy resource available within our parameters of what we believe to be a reasonable price, we will take that, because the diversification assists the overall portfolio. So we did invest in the Berkshire Wind. We have invested in a couple small hydro projects in New Hampshire, and we have a contract to invest, Mike, in a wind farm off the coast of Maine, should it be developed over the course of the next 2 years, which will further diversify our portfolio.
Yeah, I mean, diversity is the big, word, and as we try to mitigate the risk of the portfolio, and it goes all the way that, we take your load and our other members' loads, and we can aggregate, essentially the concept of bulk buying to cut better deals with suppliers because we have more volume that we're out there negotiating for. The costs of doing this, because again, it can be aggregated throughout many municipal systems in the state, becomes a very economic cost to get this service provided to your customers. So diversity, diversity, diversity.
How are we doing for time?
We're just about ready to wrap it up.
Okay.
But sit tight because we're going to continue this discussion in our next episode. But for right now, I think we've been given a lot of information on how exactly EMWIC works and how we're developing our power supply.
Yeah, and in the next episode, we're lucky to have these folks here again. We'll talk a little bit about what the energy markets look like in the next 5 to 10 years and how Shrewsbury needs to position itself to address the issues that it will be confronted with on behalf of its customers.
We want to thank you all for joining us. Quickly, briefly, if you take a look at your June statement, there is the newsletter.
Yeah.
It will give you some energy saving tips for this summer. So I think we'll have a slide up to review those with you, and hopefully you can take a look at that and use them this summer. Some examples are use the CFL bulbs or LED bulbs, air dry dishes instead of using your dishwasher, hang your laundry outside, turn off your computer, lower the thermostat on your hot water heater to 120, wash only full loads of dishes and clothes, not that anybody wants to be doing any of that this summer. Look for Energy Star label on home appliances, and unplug all your cell phones or tablet chargers when not in use. Until next time, thanks for joining us today.
Get the most from your cable subscription with Watch TV Everywhere. Catch the latest of your favorite channels on your laptop, smartphone, or tablet. In the office, at home, or on the go. Stream great content anywhere you have internet access. Log into Watch TV Everywhere to watch the best of broadcast, kids, premiums, and more. Whether you're home or traveling, the TV is always on with Selco's Watch TV Everywhere.